Far beyond the edge of known human space, a small ship drifted in silence. Its hull was cracked open in 3 places. Sparks jumped from broken wires. Inside, the air was thin and cold. This was the research vessel HFY, home to a small crew of Kethari scientists. The Kethari were a gentle species, short and thin, with soft blue skin and large dark eyes made for reading in dim light. They were not fighters. They were thinkers, healers, and explorers of the stars. They had never needed to be soldiers, because for 100 years they had lived under the peace of the Galactic Concord. That peace ended the day the Jurok Dominion found them. The Jurok were not part of the Concord. They did not believe in peace between species. They believed in strength, and in taking what they wanted from those too weak to stop them. Their warships were built for one purpose: conquest. When 3 Jurok cruisers appeared beside the HFY, the small Kethari ship had no chance. Its shields failed in seconds. Its weapons, built only for clearing space rocks from a flight path, did nothing at all. The captain of the HFY was an old Kethari named Solon Bray. He had spent his whole life studying stars, not war. But in his final moments before the Jurok boarded his ship, he did the only thing he could think to do. He sent out a distress signal. It was not aimed at any one place. It was a wide broadcast, thrown out into the dark in every direction, in the hope that someone, somewhere, might hear it and come. The message was short. It said only this: "We are being taken. We are not warriors. Please, if anyone hears this, help us." Then the Jurok cut the power to the HFY's communication array, and the signal went silent. The ship's crew was taken as prisoners. Solon Bray and his people were dragged away in chains, deep into Jurok territory, to become slaves in the mines of a world called Kruvash. Their cries for help, it seemed, would go unanswered. The signal had been sent too far, too wide, and too weak to be picked up by any Concord ship nearby. But space is a strange place. Signals do not simply vanish. They travel on, forever, unless something stops them. And 3 years after Solon Bray sent his call for help, that signal reached the edge of a quiet solar system that the wider galaxy still did not think much of. It reached Earth. At the time, humanity was still new to the greater galaxy. Only 20 years had passed since Earth's first contact with an alien species, a peaceful trading race called the Doran, who had stumbled upon a human probe near the edge of the solar system. Since then, humans had joined the Galactic Concord as one of its newest and smallest members. Most of the older species in the Concord saw humanity as young, unproven, and frankly, a little strange. Humans built machines that should not have worked, took wild risks that other species called reckless, and had a habit of forming deep bonds of loyalty with total strangers in dangerous situations. The older species did not understand this. They watched humanity carefully, unsure what to make of it. It was a human listening station, called Watchtower 9, that caught the Kethari signal. Watchtower 9 sat far out past the orbit of Neptune, a lonely outpost built to listen for anything unusual in the deep dark. Most nights, its systems caught nothing but static and old cosmic noise. But this night was different. A young technician named Priya Nasser was on shift when the alert came through. She was 26 years old, sharp-eyed, and used to long, boring nights where nothing happened. When the signal came in, faint and broken, she almost dismissed it as noise. But something in the pattern made her stop. She ran it through the translation systems the Concord had shared with Earth when humanity joined. It took almost 20 minutes for the computer to piece together a clear message from the damaged signal. "We are being taken. We are not warriors. Please, if anyone hears this, help us." Priya read the words twice. Then she picked up the comm link and called her supervisor, and within the hour, the message had been sent up the chain, all the way to Earth's newly formed Deep Space Defense Council. This was a small group of people, part military and part diplomat, whose job was to decide how humanity should respond to events happening among the stars. Most of their work, so far, had been about trade routes and diplomatic meetings. They had never faced anything like this. The council gathered that night in a room in Geneva. There were generals, scientists, and diplomats seated around a long table, all looking at the same translated message on the screen in front of them. The room was quiet for a long moment after it was read aloud. "How old is this signal?" asked General Marcus Webb, a broad-shouldered man with gray hair who led the council. Old, said Priya, who had been brought in by video link to explain her discovery. Based on the decay of the signal and the distance it traveled, we estimate it was sent almost 3 years ago. 3 years, Webb repeated. So whoever sent it may already be dead, or worse. Or still alive, said Dr. Elena Castillo, a soft-spoken woman who served as one of Earth's science advisors. The Ketathari are known to the Concord. They are a small, peaceful species. If the Jurok took them, they were likely taken as slaves, not killed outright. The Jurok value labor over waste. The room grew tense at the word slaves. Humanity's history was not free of that horror. It was a wound still remembered, still taught in schools, still carried in the bones of a species that had once done this to itself. To imagine it happening again, to another people, out there in the dark, struck something deep and old in every person in that room. We should bring this to the Concord Council, said one of the diplomats, a careful man named Julian Farrow. This is not our territory. The Jurok are dangerous, and the Kethari are not even our allies. This is exactly the kind of situation the Concord exists to manage. Webb looked at him for a long moment. And how long will the Concord debate this before they act? Farrow did not answer right away, because they all knew the truth. The Concord was slow. It was built from dozens of species with different laws, different fears, and different ideas about what counted as an acceptable risk. Getting agreement from that many voices could take months, sometimes years. We don't have years, Priya said quietly from the screen. If they're still alive, they've already waited 3. There was a long silence in the room. Then Dr. Castillo spoke again, her voice steady. I have read about the Kethari. They are gentle. They study the stars the way children study picture books, with wonder instead of ambition. They have no army because they never imagined they would need one. If we do nothing, and they are out there suffering in some Dominion mine, then we heard their cry, and we chose to look away. General Webb stood up from his chair and walked to the window. Outside, the lights of Geneva glowed against the night. He thought about his own grandfather, who had told him stories of soldiers who ran into burning buildings for strangers, of pilots who turned back for wounded crewmates, even when it cost them everything. It was not the smart thing to do. It was never the smart thing to do, but it was the human thing to do, and it always had been. Send it to the Concord, he said finally. Let them debate, but start preparing a response fleet now. If the Concord takes too long, we will not wait for permission to answer a call for help. Farrow looked uneasy. General, that could be seen as a violation of Concord protocol. Other species may see it as reckless. Some may see it as aggressive. Let them, Webb said. A child called out for help. We heard it. That is not a question of protocol. That is a question of who we are. By morning, the message had been forwarded to the Galactic Concord Council, along with a formal request for review. But in a shipyard above Earth, quietly and without waiting for anyone's approval, the first orders had already gone out to begin readying ships. Word spread fast among the crews stationed there. Pilots who had been enjoying a rare stretch of leave cut it short and reported back early. Engineers who had just gone home to their families returned to the docks without being asked twice. No one had given a final order yet. No mission had been approved. But something had shifted in the hearts of the people who heard about the signal. A cry for help had reached Earth, carried across 3 long years of empty space, and it had landed among a species that, whatever its faults, had never learned how to ignore someone in need. Far away, in the mines of Kruvash, Solon Bray had no way of knowing his message had ever been heard. He believed, as he broke rock in the dark alongside the rest of his crew, that his call had died quietly somewhere in the void. He was wrong, and soon, the Jurok Dominion would learn just how wrong he was too. The Galactic Concord Council met in a massive chamber built high above the capital city of Doran Prime, the homeworld of the species who had first welcomed humanity into the wider galaxy. The chamber was round, with seats rising in rings around a central floor, so that every member species could look upon every other as equals. It was a beautiful place, built with the idea that all voices deserve to be heard. But beautiful ideas do not always lead to fast action, and on the day the Ketari distress signal was presented, that truth became painfully clear. The Concord was made up of 11 member species, each with their own representative, their own history, and their own fears. There were the Doran, calm and diplomatic, who valued careful thought above all things. There were the Vashtu, a tall, insect-like species, who measured every decision by cost and risk. There were the Osandi, an old and cautious race who remembered wars from centuries past and rarely trusted quick decisions. And there was humanity, represented by Ambassador Renata Diaz, a woman who had spent the last 5 years learning the slow, careful rhythms of Concord politics, and who was quickly losing her patience with them. The session opened with the playback of the Ketari distress signal. The chamber fell silent as the weak, broken voice of Solon Bray echoed through the room. "We are being taken. We are not warriors. Please, if anyone hears this, help us." When it ended, there was a long pause before anyone spoke. "This is a tragedy," said the Doran representative, an elder named Thessa Vol, her voice gentle but slow. "The Kethari are known to us, peaceful, harmless. It grieves me to hear this." "Then we act," Renata said immediately. Thessa raised a thin hand. "Ambassador Diaz, I understand your urgency, but we must proceed carefully. This signal is old. The situation on the ground, wherever it is, may have changed greatly since it was sent. We do not even know if the Ketari captives are still alive." "All the more reason to move quickly," Renata said. The Vashtu representative, a clicking, chittering being named Kralis, spoke next through its translator. "Ambassador, this signal originated deep within territory controlled by the Jurak Dominion. Any rescue attempt would require crossing contested space. The Dominion does not recognize Concord authority in that region. Such an act could be seen as an act of war." "They are already at war with anyone weaker than them," Renata said. "That is what the Jurak Dominion does. They take. They enslave. If we do nothing because we're afraid of upsetting them, we are telling every small, peaceful species in this galaxy that the Concord will not help them when it matters." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. The Osandi representative, an old and slow-moving being named Korvath, raised his voice for the first time. "Ambassador Diaz, your passion is noted. But passion is not strategy. My people remember what happens when small conflicts become large ones. 300 years ago, an ally of ours entered a similar conflict with the Jurak's ancestors over a matter of principle. That conflict cost 40 million lives before it ended. We do not act rashly here. We study the situation. We gather more information. We consider our options." "How long will that take?" Renata asked. "As long as it needs to take," Korvath answered simply. Renata felt her frustration rising, but she kept her voice level, because she had learned that losing composure in this chamber only made the other species trust humans less. "With respect, Counselor Korvath, while we study and consider, real people may be dying. The message says, 3 years have already passed. Every day we spend in debate is another day the Ketari captives, if they are even still alive, remain in chains." "Then let the debate be brief," Thessa said. "But let it happen. This chamber exists so that no single species acts alone and drags the rest of us into conflicts we did not choose. That is the foundation the Concord was built on, Ambassador. You knew this when your people joined us." Renata looked around the chamber at the many faces, some familiar to her now after years of service, some still strange and unreadable. She saw caution in nearly every one of them. Not cruelty, not indifference, but a deep, old caution, born from centuries of watching conflicts spiral out of control. She understood where it came from. But she also understood something these older species seemed to have forgotten, or perhaps had simply never known in quite the same way humanity did. Sometimes waiting was its own kind of cruelty. The debate continued for hours. Proposals were raised and picked apart. Someone suggested sending a diplomatic message to the Jurak Dominion, requesting the release of any Ketari prisoners. Kralis pointed out, correctly, that the Jurak had never once responded to a diplomatic request from the Concord in the history of their contact. Someone else suggested forming a joint task force, made of ships from multiple member species, to investigate the matter further before any rescue was considered. Korvath argued that such a task force would take months to assemble, given the need for each species to approve their own involvement. Renata sat through all of it, watching the clock on the wall of the chamber, thinking of the weak, frightened voice she had heard at the start of the session. We are not warriors. Please, if anyone hears this, help us." She thought of her own people back on Earth, of General Webb and the ships he had quietly begun preparing, before she had even left for this session. She had told him she would try the Concorde first, that diplomacy deserved a chance. But sitting here now, watching careful, decent people talk themselves in circles, out of fear of a war none of them wanted, she understood that the chance was already slipping away. Near the end of the session, Thessa Vol turned to her directly. "Ambassador Diaz, what does Earth propose?" Renata rose from her seat. The chamber quieted, as it always did when the newest member species spoke, half out of respect and half out of curiosity, since humanity still surprised them more often than any other species in the Concorde. "Earth proposes that this council continue its review," she said carefully. "We will not stand in the way of a Concorde-wide response, should one be reached. But Earth cannot, in good conscience, promise to wait indefinitely, while innocent lives may hang in the balance. If this council reaches a decision, we will support it fully. If this council cannot reach a decision in time, Earth reserves the right to act on its own." The chamber erupted into quiet but urgent conversation. Korvath's expression darkened. "Ambassador, that is not how this Concorde functions. Unilateral action by a member species, especially one so new, could destabilize the trust this body is built upon." "With respect, Counselor," Renata said, "a species crying out for help and being left to wait while we debate procedure is what destabilizes trust. Not just in this Concorde, but in the idea that any of us stand for something more than our own safety." She did not wait for a response. She gathered her things, gave a small, respectful bow to the chamber, as custom required, and left. Behind her, the debate continued, as it likely would for days, perhaps weeks. But Renata already knew, walking down the long corridor outside the chamber, that she would be sending a message to Earth the moment she reached her quarters. Not a request, a confirmation. That night, far above Doran Prime, a small human courier ship broke orbit and turned toward home, carrying Renata's report. Behind her, the Concorde Council continued to debate, its many voices circling the same careful questions they had circled for hours. But meaning well and moving quickly were not always the same thing, and out in the dark, a species that had learned that lesson the hard way, over and over again throughout its own bloody history, was no longer willing to wait and find out which one the Concorde would choose. By the time Renata's ship reached Earth's system 3 days later, the fleet was already nearly ready to launch. The shipyard above Earth was called Anchor Station, and in the days after General Webb gave his quiet order to prepare, it transformed from a place of routine maintenance into something closer to a hive. Lights burned around the clock. Engineers worked in shifts that overlapped, so there was never a silent hour. Pilots ran drills long after their official training hours ended, not because anyone made them, but because none of them wanted to be the reason a mission failed. Among the alien observers stationed at Anchor Station, as part of a standing Concorde liaison agreement, this sudden burst of activity was more than a little unsettling. One of these observers was a Doran engineer named Elira Voss, a calm, careful woman who had spent 2 years studying human shipbuilding methods. She had grown used to the strange, energetic pace of human work. But what she saw in those first days, after the distress signal reached Earth, was something new even to her. "They are not simply preparing a mission," she said to her colleague, over a secure comm line, back to Doran Prime. "They are preparing for war, and they are doing it in days, not months." That was not quite true, and it was not quite false either. The ships being readied at Anchor Station were not new. Most of them were vessels already built and stationed for Earth's home defense, part of a fleet humanity had built quickly after joining the Concorde, aware of just how young and vulnerable they still were among older, stronger species. But the way these ships were being outfitted now was different from anything in the standard Concorde playbook, where Concorde doctrine called for careful, layered engagement rules designed to minimize risk and avoid escalation. The officers overseeing Anchor Station's preparations were drawing from something older. Earth's own military history was full of operations built not around caution, but around commitment. Search and rescue missions flown into storms no sane pilot would enter. Medical teams who ran toward gunfire instead of away from it. Small units who held a line not because it was smart, but because retreating meant leaving someone behind. Commander Elias Okafor, the officer chosen to lead the mission, understood this history better than most. His own grandfather had served in a peacekeeping mission decades earlier, one where soldiers had ignored direct orders to withdraw so they could carry wounded civilians to safety. Okafor had grown up on those stories. He had joined the military because of them. Standing on the observation deck of Anchor Station, looking out at the ships being fitted with medical bays, reinforced hulls, and rescue pods far larger than any standard Concorde vessel carried, Okafor allowed himself a small, tired smile. "We're not building warships," he said to the officer beside him. "We're building a promise. We just have to make sure the promise can survive contact with the Jurok." That promise took physical form over the following days. 8 ships were selected for the mission, a mix of frigates and one larger cruiser, named the Solace, which would serve as Okafor's flagship. The Solace was not the newest or the most powerful ship in Earth's fleet, but it had been built with something the newer designs lacked: an enormous medical bay, originally intended for disaster relief work along Earth's own coastlines during a string of bad storms years earlier. That bay could hold hundreds of survivors if needed. It felt, to Okafor, like the right ship for the job. The crews assigned to the mission were told only that this was a voluntary deployment into contested space, with real danger and no guarantee of Concorde support if things went wrong. Every single person offered the chance to step back did not take it. Some, in fact, had to be turned away, because far more volunteered than the mission required. Illyra Voss watched this recruitment process with growing fascination, and no small amount of confusion. She requested, and was granted, permission to speak with some of the volunteers directly, hoping to understand what she was seeing. She found Lieutenant Sarah Kwan in one of the training bays, running simulations for the boarding teams who would eventually storm the Jurok facility if intelligence located the Kethari prisoners. Kwan was 29, sharp and quick, with the kind of easy confidence that came from years of trusting her own instincts. "May I ask you something?" Illyra said, approaching carefully. "This mission carries significant risk. Casualty estimates prepared by your own strategists suggest as much as 30% of this fleet could be lost. Why would you volunteer for that?" Kwan paused her simulation and thought about the question seriously, rather than brushing it off. "Because somebody out there is scared and waiting for someone to come," she said. "That's it, really. That's the whole reason." "But you do not know these Kethari," Illyra said. "You have never met them. They are not your people, not your allies, not even part of your own species." Kwan shrugged. "Doesn't matter. If it was one of yours calling for help, we'd go too. If it was one of ours, I'd hope somebody like the Kethari would come for us. That's kind of the whole point, isn't it? Otherwise, what's the point of any of this? Of being out here at all?" Illyra found she did not have a good answer to that, and the conversation stayed with her long after she left the training bay. She spoke with several more crew members over the following days, from engineers to medics to the pilots who would fly the frigates into what could easily become a deadly battle. She heard variations of the same answer again and again. They spoke of duty, but not the cold, procedural duty she had seen in other species' militaries. This was something warmer, and in its way, far more unsettling. It was personal. Every single person she spoke to had already imagined the Kethari captives as real people, suffering and afraid, and had decided, individually and without being ordered to, that this mattered enough to risk their lives over. She also noticed something else, something that struck her as strange among a crew about to enter what could become a serious armed conflict. There was laughter in the corridors of Anchor Station. Pilots joked with each other before drills. Engineers played music while running final diagnostics. Medical teams shared stories and small gifts before shipping out, the way people do before a long trip, not the way soldiers usually behaved before what everyone privately understood might be a battle many of them would not return from. When Illyra mentioned this to Commander Okafor, he explained it simply. "If we walked around here like we were already dead, this crew would fall apart before we even launched. We laugh because it reminds us why we're doing this. We're not going out there to die. We're going out there so somebody else doesn't have to." 3 days before launch, General Webb arrived at Anchor Station in person to address the assembled crews. He stood before them in the largest hangar bay, the Solace looming behind him, its hull freshly painted with the mission's chosen name, stenciled in simple letters near the bow. Answered. "Some of you have asked me what happens if the Concorde condemns this mission," Webb said, his voice carrying across the silent hangar. "Some of you have asked what happens if the Jurok Dominion sees this as an act of war. I won't lie to you. Those are real risks, and I won't pretend otherwise." He paused, looking out over the rows of assembled crew, hundreds of faces watching him in silence. But 3 years ago, a small, gentle people sent a message out into the dark, hoping somebody, anybody, would hear it and come. We heard it. That is not something we can unhear, and it is not something I am willing to pretend we never received. Whatever the Concorde decides, whatever the Jurok choose to do about it, Earth is not the kind of home that lets a cry for help go unanswered. Not while we have ships that can fly, and not while we have people willing to fly them. The hangar erupted into a roar of applause and shouted agreement that startled even Alira Voss, who stood quietly near the back of the crowd, watching with wide, thoughtful eyes. 2 days later, the fleet launched from Anchor Station under the cover of a routine training exercise designation, a small diplomatic fiction meant to buy time before the Concorde Council, still locked in its slow debates, realized what Earth had actually done. 8 ships broke Earth orbit and turned their engines toward the edge of known space, carrying nearly 2,000 crew members, who had all, in their own way, made the same simple and dangerous choice. Alira Voss watched the fleet depart from the observation deck, the light of their engines fading slowly into the dark. She thought of what Lieutenant Quan had told her days earlier, and found herself, for the first time in her long career as a careful and cautious Doran engineer, hoping with everything she had that these strange, stubborn, wildly emotional humans would somehow succeed. Behind her, a quiet alert chimed on her console. The Concorde Council, after days of deliberation, had finally reached a preliminary decision on the Ketari matter. It had arrived 2 days too late to matter. The edge of Jurok Dominion space was marked by nothing more than an invisible line agreed upon by old treaties and older fears. There were no walls in space, no fences, only the quiet understanding among the Concorde's member species that beyond this point, a different kind of law applied, one written by whoever held the biggest guns. For centuries, that had kept most species far away from Dominion territory, content to let the Jurok rule their side of the galaxy in whatever brutal way they pleased, so long as they did not push past that line. Commander Elias Okafor's fleet crossed that line on the 9th day of their journey, and every person aboard the 8 ships felt the shift the moment they did. Sensor operators reported a change in the background chatter picked up across the comm frequencies, rougher, harsher signals that had nothing to do with trade or diplomacy. Pilots tightened their grips on their controls. In the medical bay of the Solace, nurses quietly checked supplies one more time, though they had already checked them a dozen times before. Alira Voss, the Doran engineer who had been granted special permission to accompany the fleet as an official Concorde observer, stood on the bridge of the Solace beside Commander Okafor, watching the sensor readouts. Dominion patrols typically operate in groups of 3 along border routes such as this one, she said. If we are detected, they will likely attempt to intercept before we get much further. Let them try, Okafor said quietly, though his eyes stayed fixed on the screens. It did not take long. Barely 6 hours after crossing the border, sensors picked up 3 Jurok vessels moving fast on an intercept course. They were sleek, dark ships, built with jagged, aggressive lines that made no attempt to hide what they were built for. Unlike Concorde ships, which followed careful design standards meant to balance offense, defense, and efficiency, Jurok vessels were built almost entirely for one purpose: to overwhelm anything smaller than themselves as quickly and violently as possible. For centuries, that strategy had worked, because most species who wandered into Dominion territory were exactly that: smaller, weaker, and easily overwhelmed. The Jurok patrol leader, a broad, armored being named Vrag Kesh, watched the approaching human fleet on his own sensors, with something close to amusement. He had received reports about this new species called humans, small, soft-bodied creatures, from a young and unimportant system near Concorde space. His superiors had dismissed them as unlikely to cause any trouble. 8 ships, entering Dominion space uninvited, seemed like an easy lesson to teach. Hail them, Vrag ordered. Tell them to turn back or be destroyed. The message reached the Solace moments later, translated by the fleet's linguistic systems into blunt, simple words. Turn back. This is Dominion territory. Any vessel that continues forward will be destroyed. Okafor listened to the translation, then turned to his communications officer. Reply with this, he said. We are here for the Kethari prisoners, taken from the research vessel Alan Vey. Release them to us, and we will leave your territory peacefully. This is your only warning. The reply came back within seconds, and it was not words at all. It was weapons fire. Vrag Kesh had not expected a response like this from a species he considered beneath serious concern, but he had also not expected them to actually mean their warning, and he certainly had not expected them to fight back the way they did in the moments that followed. The Jurok opened fire first, their heavy plasma cannons designed to punch through the hulls of far larger ships in a single hit. But Okafor's fleet had spent the entire journey drilling for exactly this moment, running simulation after simulation, based on every scrap of intelligence the Concord had ever gathered on Jurok combat patterns. The human ships scattered the moment the first shots were fired, breaking into a coordinated pattern that no Concord fleet would have used, one built more on instinct and old naval doctrine from Earth's own history than on any modern tactical manual. Two of the frigates, the Halberd and the Meridian, peeled off in opposite directions, drawing two of the Jurok ships into a chase that pulled them apart from each other and from their commander. The remaining frigates closed in fast on Vrag Kesh's own ship, moving in tight, aggressive formation that gave the Jurok gunners almost no clean shot to take. It was reckless. It was the kind of tactic that traded caution for speed, betting everything on getting close before the enemy's superior firepower could be brought fully to bear. It was also exactly what the human pilots had trained for, over and over, until it had become instinct. Vrag Kesh, watching his sensor board fill with warnings as the human ships closed distance far faster than any Concord vessel he had ever fought, felt his first flicker of genuine concern. Pull back, he ordered his own ship's pilot. Widen the gap. It was too late. The lead human frigate, the Kestrel, released a spread of small, fast missiles designed not to punch through Jurok armor directly, but to disable engines and weapons systems, a tactic built around disabling rather than destroying, something almost no Jurok commander had ever encountered before, since Dominion doctrine assumed every enemy fought to kill. The missiles struck true, tearing through Vrag Kesh's engine array and leaving his ship crippled and drifting. Aboard the two chasing frigates, the Halberd and the Meridian, similar tactics played out. The two Jurok ships that had taken the bait found themselves boxed in by human pilots who fought with a strange combination of aggression and coordination that felt, to the Jurok crews, almost unnervingly personal, as though every human pilot was fighting not for territory or glory, but for something they refused to let go of. Both Jurok ships were disabled within minutes, their crews left shaken and confused by how quickly the battle had turned against them. Back on the Solace, Illyra Voss watched the battle unfold across the tactical display, with something close to disbelief. "Commander," she said quietly, "your fleet destroyed no enemy vessels in that engagement. You disabled all three." "That's the idea," Okafor said. "We're not here to kill anyone if we don't have to. We're here for the Kethari." "But if you had destroyed them, the risk to your own fleet would have been lower," Illyra pointed out. "Disabling, rather than destroying, required your pilots to take greater risks, flying closer, exposing themselves longer." "I know," Okafor said simply. "We did it anyway." He ordered a boarding party sent to Vrag Kesh's crippled ship, both to secure any information they might have about the location of Kethari prisoners in the region, and, though he did not say this part aloud to Illyra, because some old part of him could not stomach leaving even an enemy crew to die slowly in a drifting, powerless ship in the cold of open space. The boarding party moved quickly and efficiently, subduing the shaken Jurok crew with non-lethal force and securing the bridge within minutes. Vrag Kesh, disarmed and restrained, stared up at the human soldiers standing over him, with a mixture of confusion and something close to fear, an emotion he had not felt in years of serving in the Dominion's forces. "You did not kill us," he said slowly, through a translator device one of the soldiers held out to him. "Why?" The soldier, a young sergeant named Diego Reyes, looked down at him for a long moment. "Because we didn't have to," he said, Now, you're going to tell us where the Ketthari prisoners from the HFY are being held. And you're going to do it because it's the only thing standing between you and a long, cold wait for a Dominion rescue ship that might not come for weeks. Word of the battle spread fast, both through the small human fleet, where it settled quiet and grim resolve into every crew member's chest, and eventually back through Dominion communication channels, where it landed very differently. When senior Dominion commanders reviewed the reports from the destroyed patrol, they found the details deeply unsettling. A patrol of 3 armed cruisers, defeated not by superior weapons, but by tactics no Jurok officer had ever encountered, executed by a species most of them had never even heard of before that day. Far behind Jurok lines, in a mining facility on the harsh, rocky world of Kruvash, Solon Bray and the surviving crew of the HFY continued their forced labor, unaware that 3 years after their message had vanished into the dark, it had not only been heard, but had already begun tearing a bloody, determined path straight toward them. Above them, in orbit, the human fleet regrouped, patched their few damaged systems, and set their course deeper into Dominion territory, carrying with them coordinates pulled reluctantly from Vrag Kesh's own command logs. They were close now, and nothing the Dominion had shown them so far suggested they were prepared to stop. Kruvash was a hard, gray world, with a thin, cold atmosphere, and skies the color of rust. It had no native life of its own, only endless fields of mineral-rich rock that the Jurak Dominion had turned into one of its largest labor colonies. For decades, ships had come and gone from Kruvash, carrying ore mined by the hands of prisoners, taken from a dozen conquered worlds. Among them, for the last 3 years, had been the surviving crew of the research vessel, HFY. Solon Bray had aged badly in his captivity. His once bright blue skin had turned dull and gray from lack of proper light and food. His hands, once used only for delicate scientific instruments, were now scarred and calloused from years of mining work. But his mind remained sharp, and every night, in the cramped, freezing barracks where the Ketthari prisoners were kept, he told the younger members of his crew the same thing he had told them since the day they were captured. "We do not know if anyone heard our call," he would say quietly, once the Jurak guards had moved past on their rounds. "But we sent it. That matters. It means somewhere out there, someone knows we existed, even if they never come." He did not truly believe rescue would come. He had told himself this so many times over 3 long years that he had almost made peace with it. Almost. On the morning everything changed, Solon was working the eastern quarry alongside a dozen other Ketthari prisoners, breaking rock under the watchful eyes of 2 armed Jurok guards, when the ground beneath them shook with a force none of them had ever felt before. Far above, though none of the prisoners could see it clearly, through Kruvash's dusty atmosphere, the sky had begun to burn with the light of ship engines and weapons fire. Commander Okafor's fleet had arrived. The information pulled from Vrag Kesh's command logs had led them here, to Kruvash, though the intelligence had been old and incomplete, leaving Okafor's crew with only a general idea of where on the vast mining world the Ketthari prisoners might be held. The orbital defenses around Kruvash were far heavier than anything the small border patrol had shown them days earlier. Dominion warships, alerted by the destruction of Vrag Kesh's patrol, had gathered in greater numbers to protect the valuable mining colony. The battle that followed was the fiercest the human fleet had faced yet. Jurok warships, larger and more heavily armed than the border patrol, closed in fast, their commanders determined not to repeat the mistakes of the previous engagement. Okafor's ships fought hard, using every trick their crews had trained for, weaving through incoming fire, drawing enemy attention away from the Solace, which carried the majority of the fleet's boarding teams and medical staff. Aboard the Solace, Lieutenant Sarah Kwan led one of 2 boarding teams, preparing to launch toward the surface the moment an opening presented itself. She checked her equipment one final time, glancing at the small photo she kept tucked inside her suit, a picture of her younger sister back on Earth, the reason, if she was honest with herself, that stories about people being taken and enslaved had always struck her harder than most. "Command reports a gap opening in their defense grid near the eastern quarry sector," came the voice of the Solace's tactical officer over the comm. "It won't last long. Boarding teams, you are cleared to launch." Kwan and her team dropped from the Solace in a fast, armored transport shuttle, cutting through Kruvash's thin atmosphere in a controlled dive that left her stomach somewhere behind her. Below, through the shuttle's viewport, she could see the gray sprawl of the mining colony, dotted with guard towers and fenced workyards. The shuttle set down hard near the edge of the eastern quarry, and Quan's team moved fast, clearing the two surprised Jurok guards stationed nearby before they could raise an alarm. What Quan saw next stayed with her for the rest of her life. Dozens of Kethari prisoners, thin, exhausted, and clearly afraid, stood frozen in the quarry, staring at the armored human soldiers who had just appeared among them, as though they had fallen from the sky. Solon Bray stepped forward slowly, unsure of what he was seeing. It had been so long since he had allowed himself to hope for anything like this, that some part of him wondered if the mining work and the thin Kruvash air had finally begun to affect his mind. Are you here for us?" he asked, his voice shaking. Quan lowered her weapon and pulled off her helmet, wanting him to see her face, human and unmistakably real. "We got your message," she said gently. "It took a while to reach us. I'm sorry it took so long. But we're here now." Solon Bray, who had endured 3 years of captivity without breaking, who had held his crew together through cold nights and endless labor by sheer force of will, felt his legs give out beneath him. Quan caught him before he hit the ground, and for a moment, in the middle of a battlefield, on a hostile alien world, an exhausted Kethari elder wept openly in the arms of a soldier from a species he had never even known existed until that very moment. There was no time for a long reunion. Alarms had begun sounding across the mining colony, and Jurok reinforcements were already moving toward the quarry. Quan's team worked quickly, guiding the Kethari prisoners toward the waiting shuttle, while a second boarding team, led by Sergeant Diego Reyes, secured a defensive perimeter to hold off the approaching guards. The Jurok response, when it came, was brutal. A squad of heavily armed Dominion soldiers arrived at the edge of the quarry, opening fire the moment they had a clear line of sight. Reyes and his team returned fire, using the quarry's rock formations for cover, buying precious time for Quan's team to finish loading the frightened, weakened prisoners aboard the shuttle. One of Reyes's soldiers, a young private named Anna Kowalski, took a hit to her shoulder while helping an elderly Kethari woman to safety, but refused to fall back until the woman was secured aboard the shuttle, gritting her teeth through the pain and continuing to fire her weapon one-handed until the retreat order finally came. It was this kind of moment, small and largely unseen by history, that came to define the entire rescue mission in the months that followed, whenever it was later discussed among Concord military analysts studying human tactics. Human soldiers, again and again throughout the operation, prioritized the safety of the people they had come to rescue over their own, even when doing so put them at greater risk. It was not efficient. By any standard measure of military strategy, it was not the smart choice. But it was the choice made, consistently, by nearly every human soldier on the ground that day. With the last of the Kethari prisoners loaded aboard, the shuttle lifted off from Kruvash's surface, just as a second wave of Jurok reinforcements arrived at the quarry, too late to stop the rescue. Above the planet, Okafor's fleet fought a fierce, costly battle to hold open a path for the shuttle to reach orbit safely, taking damage across nearly every ship but refusing to break formation and abandon the extraction. Aboard the shuttle, as it broke free of Kruvash's thin atmosphere and climbed toward the waiting Solace, Solon Bray sat wrapped in a warm emergency blanket, surrounded by the surviving members of his crew, many of them crying quietly, some laughing in disbelief, all of them still struggling to accept that after 3 long years, they were finally, truly free. Sarah Quan sat beside him, checking on the wounded among the group, while medics moved quickly to treat the worst injuries. Solon looked at her for a long moment before speaking again. "You do not know us," he said softly. "We are not your people. We could offer your species nothing in return for what you have done here today. Why would you risk so much for strangers?" Quan thought about the question for a moment, the same question Alira Voss had asked back at Anchor Station days earlier, though this time, it came from someone she had just pulled out of chains, and it landed very differently. "Because somebody has to be the one who comes," she said finally, "and we decided a long time ago that we'd rather be that somebody than not." Solon Bray said nothing more, but he reached out and gently took her hand, a simple Ketathari gesture of deep gratitude that needed no translation at all. Behind them, through the shuttle's small window, the battle above Kruvash continued to rage, the human fleet still fighting to secure their escape from a system the Jurok Dominion had, until that day, considered completely and permanently their own. In a command center deep within Dominion territory, on the heavily fortified world of Vorun Cade, Grand Marshal Thesic Rowe received word of the events at Kruvash with a fury that made his junior officers shrink back from him. A border patrol destroyed, a mining colony breached, prisoners freed. And all of it, according to the reports on his desk, carried out by a small fleet from a species called humans, a species his own intelligence officers had dismissed as insignificant only weeks earlier. 8 ships, he said slowly, reading the report a second time, as though the number might change if he looked at it long enough. 8 ships did this? Yes, Grand Marshal, said the officer standing before him, careful to keep his voice steady. Our forces at Kruvash sustained heavy losses. 3 additional vessels disabled, 1 destroyed outright when it attempted to block the human fleet's escape route. The humans successfully extracted all surviving Ketathari prisoners from the eastern quarry sector. Thesic Rowe set the report down slowly. In his 3 decades of service to the Dominion, he had overseen the conquest of 11 worlds. He had never once seen a Concord species act with this kind of speed, aggression, and coordination outside of a full, declared war. The Jurok understood the Concord well. They understood its caution, its endless committees, its reluctance to risk conflict. This did not fit that pattern at all. This cannot be allowed to stand, Thesic said. If word spreads that 8 human ships broke into Dominion territory and successfully freed prisoners from one of our colonies, every conquered world under our control will see it as proof that we can be challenged. We will see uprisings within months. He ordered a full battle fleet assembled, nearly 40 warships, drawn from 3 different border sectors, with instructions to intercept and destroy the retreating human fleet before it could reach Concord space. He intended to make an example so thorough and so brutal that no species, human or otherwise, would ever again consider testing Dominion borders. What Thesic Rowe did not know, as his massive fleet began forming up along the projected human retreat path, was that Commander Okafor's small fleet was no longer alone. Back on Earth, in the days following the fleet's departure, General Webb had not simply sent 8 ships into hostile territory and hoped for the best. Understanding the very real possibility that Okafor's fleet might need reinforcement, or might not survive at all, Webb had quietly begun assembling a second, much larger fleet, ready to follow behind the first at a careful distance, prepared to respond the moment they received word of the rescue's outcome, whatever that outcome turned out to be. This second fleet, numbering nearly 30 ships, had been gathering just beyond the edge of Concord space, technically still within neutral territory, but close enough to respond quickly if needed. When word reached them of the successful rescue at Kruvash, and of the massive Jurok fleet now moving to intercept Okafor's battered, retreating ships, the order to advance came within minutes. Admiral Grace Halloway, commanding the Second Fleet, had served in Earth's military for over 20 years, and had spent much of her early career studying the exact kind of situation she now found herself in. A smaller force in danger, needing rescue, with the clock running out fast. She gathered her senior officers briefly, before giving the order to move. Commander Okafor's fleet is exhausted, damaged, and outnumbered nearly 5 to 1, she said. They went out there to answer someone else's cry for help. Now it's our turn to answer theirs. The 2 fleets, Jurok and human, met in open space, roughly 2 days after the Kruvash rescue, in a region the Concord star charts labeled only as the Vesic Expanse, an empty stretch of space that would, after that day, be remembered by a very different name entirely. Okafor's fleet, badly damaged from the fighting at Kruvash and running low on both fuel and ammunition, found themselves facing Thesic Rowe's massive intercepting force with grim resolve, prepared to fight to the last ship if it meant protecting the freed Ketathari prisoners still aboard the Solace. Thesic Rowe, watching the small, battered human fleet through his own sensors, felt a grim satisfaction. This would be quick. It was not quick. Admiral Halloway's reinforcement fleet arrived from an unexpected vector, having plotted a wide, careful approach, specifically designed to catch the Jurak fleet by surprise from the flank, rather than approaching head-on. 30 fresh, fully armed human warships dropped out of transit directly into the middle of Thessic Row's formation, weapons already firing before the stunned Jurak sensor operators had even finished registering their arrival. The battle that followed became, in the years afterward, one of the most studied engagements in Concord military history. Thessic Row's fleet, though far larger, found itself caught between Okafor's battered but determined ships pressing from one side, and Holloway's fresh reinforcements striking hard from the other. The coordinated human tactics that had already proven so effective at the border and at Kruvash were now deployed at a much larger scale, with devastating results. Jurak commanders, trained their entire careers to expect predictable, cautious behavior from Concord-aligned species, found themselves completely unable to anticipate the aggressive, sacrificial, deeply coordinated fighting style the human fleets employed. Ships that should have retreated when damaged instead pushed forward to protect wounded allies. Pilots took risks that Jurak doctrine considered suicidal, and somehow, again and again, survived them, or accomplished their objective even when they did not. Grand Marshal Thessic Row watched his once overwhelming numerical advantage collapse within the first hour of battle, as ship after ship in his formation was disabled or destroyed by human tactics his own officers simply could not counter in time. By the second hour, with nearly half his fleet crippled or destroyed, and no sign of the human forces slowing their assault, he made the decision no Jurak commander in his position had ever wanted to make. He ordered a retreat. It was, in Dominion military history, an almost unheard-of event. The Jurak Dominion had built its entire military doctrine around the assumption that they would always hold the advantage of strength and numbers against any Concord-aligned force. That assumption shattered completely in the Vesic Expanse, in a battle fought not over territory or resources, but over the freedom of a small group of prisoners that most of the galaxy, until recently, had never even heard of. Aboard the Solace, as the Jurak fleet broke and scattered, Commander Okafor allowed himself, for the first time in days, to breathe fully. He walked slowly to the medical bay, where the rescued Kethari prisoners had been resting throughout the battle, protected deep within the ship's most heavily reinforced section. Solon Bray sat near the front of the bay, having refused several requests from the medical staff to rest, insisting instead on watching the tactical displays as the battle unfolded, needing to see with his own eyes what was happening to the people who had risked so much for his crew. "It is over?" Solon asked as Okafor entered. "For now," Okafor said. "The Jurak fleet is retreating. We're not out of danger yet, but the worst of it should be behind us." Solon was quiet for a moment, processing this. "Your people fought an entire fleet, larger than the one that took us captive 3 years ago, simply to protect the promise you made when you rescued us." "We didn't make a promise," Okafor said. "We just didn't see any other option that felt right." Solon studied him for a long moment, his large dark eyes thoughtful. "Among my people, there is an old saying, a promise made without words is the strongest kind, because it asks for nothing in return, not even to be remembered as a promise at all." Word of the battle at the Vesic Expanse reached the Galactic Concord Council within days, arriving not through official human diplomatic channels, but through independent reports from several neutral trading vessels that had witnessed portions of the engagement from a safe distance. The Council, still technically in the middle of its slow deliberations over how to respond to the original Kethari distress signal, found itself instead debating something far more significant, the fact that a Concord member species, acting entirely on its own initiative, had fought and decisively defeated a major Jurak Dominion fleet. Ambassador Renata Diaz, called before the Council once again to explain Earth's actions, stood in the same chamber where she had argued fruitlessly for swift action just weeks earlier. This time, the room was silent not from caution, but from something closer to shock. "The Kethari prisoners from the Alun Ve have been safely returned to their people," she said simply. "Earth's fleet sustained losses, but the mission succeeded. We did not wait for this Council's decision, because we did not believe waiting was something we could justify to ourselves. I understand that may trouble some of you. I hope, in time, you will understand why we made the choice we did." Grand Marshal Thessic Row, meanwhile, returned to Dominion territory, to deliver a report that would end his long military career and force the wider Dominion leadership to seriously reconsider, for the first time in generations, whether the young, strange species known as humanity truly deserved the dismissive judgment they had given it only weeks before. 6 months after the battle in the Vesic Expanse, the Galactic Concord Council chamber on Doran Prime looked much the same as it always had. The same round room, the same rising rings of seats, the same careful lighting designed to put every species at ease. But the mood inside it had changed in ways that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had sat through the slow, cautious debates over the original Ketari distress signal. The Ketari themselves had been granted a seat in the chamber that day, a small honor extended to species under Concord protection, allowed to speak on matters directly affecting them. Solon Bray, fully recovered from his years of captivity, though still thinner than he had once been, stood before the assembled representatives of 11 species to speak for the first time since his rescue. 3 years ago, he began, his voice steady despite the weight of the memory. My crew was taken from our research vessel and enslaved by the Jurok Dominion. I sent a message into the dark, not truly believing anyone would hear it. I have since learned that a species I knew nothing about, who owed my people nothing, heard that message and decided, without being asked and without waiting for permission from this council, that they would come for us anyway. He turned to where Ambassador Renata Diaz sat among the human delegation. I do not know how to properly thank a people for choosing, entirely on their own, that strangers mattered enough to risk everything. I am not certain such a thing can be properly thanked at all. I only know that my crew and I are alive today because of that choice, and the Ketari people will not forget it. The chamber was silent for a long moment after he finished. Then, slowly, the Doran representative Thessa Vol rose from her seat. When this council first learned of the Ketari distress signal, she said carefully, I argued for caution. I still believe caution has its place in matters of this importance. But I have spent the months since reconsidering what caution costs when it is allowed to become an excuse for delay. The Ketari people were rescued, not because this council acted, but because it did not act quickly enough, and one of our member species chose not to wait for us. She looked directly at Renata Diaz as she continued. That should trouble this council more than it should trouble Earth. The debate that followed, unlike the one that had dragged on for weeks over the original distress signal, moved with unusual speed. Within that single session, the council voted to formally recognize the Ketari as a protected species under full Concord defense agreements, ensuring that any future threat against them would trigger an immediate, coordinated response, rather than the slow deliberation that had nearly cost them everything the first time. It was, several older representatives noted quietly afterward, the fastest major decision the council had reached in over a decade. But the changes rippling through the Concord went far beyond a single new protection agreement. In the months following the battle at the Vesic Expanse, word of what had happened spread across nearly every member world, carried by traders, diplomats, and the crews of the many neutral ships that had witnessed portions of the fighting firsthand. The story grew in the telling, as stories often do, but even stripped of exaggeration, the core of it remained remarkable enough on its own. A small young species, barely 20 years into galactic contact, had crossed hostile territory, rescued a group of enslaved strangers, and then defeated a Jurok Dominion fleet more than 4 times its own size, all without waiting for permission from anyone. Among the older, more established Concord species, the reaction to this story was complicated. Some, like the cautious Asandi representative Korvath, remained deeply uneasy about the precedent it set, worried about a galaxy where individual species might increasingly choose unilateral action over careful, collective decision-making. Others, particularly among the Concord's smaller and more vulnerable member species, found something deeply reassuring in what humanity had done. For the first time in generations, small, peaceful species, who had always understood themselves to be at the mercy of larger, more aggressive powers, began to feel, cautiously, that perhaps they were not quite as alone as they had always assumed. Requests for defense cooperation agreements with Earth increased sharply in the months that followed, arriving from species who had previously shown little interest in close ties with humanity, viewing them as too new, too unpredictable, and too small to be useful allies. Now, Many of those same species found themselves reconsidering, drawn less by humanity's technology, which remained modest compared to older Concord powers, and more by something harder to quantify, a demonstrated willingness to act, decisively and personally, when someone else was in danger. Illyra Voss, the Doran engineer who had accompanied Okafor's fleet as an observer, was asked to present a formal report to the Doran government on what she had witnessed. She spent weeks preparing it, drawing on both her technical observations of human ship design and tactics, and her many conversations with the crew members who had volunteered for a mission most other species would have considered close to suicidal. "I came away from this experience," she wrote in her closing summary, "with a deeper respect for humanity than I expected, but also, I will admit, a measure of genuine unease. Humans do not calculate risk the way most of our member species do. They do not ask first whether an action is wise, or safe, or likely to succeed. They ask, instead, whether it is right, and having decided that it is, they commit to it fully, regardless of the cost. This makes them, I believe, both the most reassuring and the most unsettling ally the Concord has ever welcomed into its ranks. I would not wish to be their enemy. I am deeply grateful, after what I witnessed at Kruvash and in the Vesic Expanse, that I am not." Back on Earth, the crews who had flown the original rescue mission returned home to a level of public attention few of them had expected or particularly wanted. Lieutenant Sarah Kwan found herself, somewhat to her own discomfort, treated as something of a public figure in the months following her return, invited to speak at events she would have preferred to avoid. She accepted only a few of these invitations, and in each one, she gave largely the same simple answer when asked why she had volunteered for a mission that had, by every reasonable measure, been extremely dangerous. "Somebody has to be willing to go," she would say. "It might as well be us." Commander Okafor, promoted following the mission's success, used much of his new authority to push for the creation of a standing rapid response unit within Earth's growing military structure, specifically designed to answer exactly this kind of distant, urgent call for help in the future, without needing to wait for either full Concord approval or the kind of scrambled, improvised preparation that had marked the original Kruvash mission. He named the unit, with the full support of General Webb, the Answered Fleet, after the ship that had led the original rescue. Solon Bray, once his recovery was complete, chose to remain closely connected to the human delegation at the Concord Council, eventually serving as a kind of informal liaison between the Ketthari people and Earth, a role that grew naturally out of genuine friendship rather than any formal appointment. He visited Earth itself twice in the following year, walking through cities he had once believed he would never live to see, meeting ordinary people who had no direct connection to his rescue, but who nonetheless greeted him with a warmth he had not expected from strangers. On one such visit, standing with Ambassador Renata Diaz on a quiet balcony overlooking a city at night, Solon asked her a question that had lingered in his mind since his rescue. "Do you believe your people will always answer when a cry like ours reaches you? Even when it is difficult? Even when it costs you greatly?" Renata considered the question carefully before answering. "I can't promise you every single person will always agree on how to respond, or that we'll always get it right," she said. "We're not perfect, and we never will be. But I believe, yes, that somewhere in us, there's something that won't let us simply look away when someone is in trouble. It's cost us a great deal throughout our history, that instinct. It's also, I think, saved us just as many times as it's hurt us." Solon nodded slowly, looking out over the lights of the unfamiliar city that had, in its own quiet way, become a second home to him. "Then I hope, for the sake of this galaxy, that instinct never fades." Far above them, in the quiet dark of Earth's orbit, the ships of the newly formed Answered Fleet continued their rounds, their sensors tuned outward, listening patiently across the vast silence of space for whatever the next distress call might bring. They did not know when it would come, or from where, or what it would ask of them, but when it did arrive, whenever and wherever that happened to be, there would be ships ready to answer it, crewed by people who had already decided, long before that call ever reached them, exactly what kind of answer they intended to give.